Buenos días, clase. Hoy hemos llegado a la segunda parte del capítulo 18, el último capítulo de nuestro libro. So by now, you've seen a ton of tenses and it's possible that you might be confused with the subjunctive as to when to use it versus an indicative tense or the infinitive. So we're going to summarize all the subjunctives that we've seen, and that way hopefully we can start telling them apart from the indicative and the infinitive, okay? So let's move on. First, let's take a look at the present subjunctive and the past subjunctive. So here you have just the chart with their endings. That way you can tell them apart. You have something to refer to. The present subjunctive, hable, hables, hable, hablemos, habléis, hablen. Past subjunctive, hablara, hablaras, hablara, habláramos, hablarais, hablaran. And then, of course, they give you an example where the ending is er and ir. Beba, bebiera, viva, viviera, and so on. So that's the mechanics of the present and the past subjunctive. Now let's take a look at the present perfect subjunctive. The present perfect subjunctive is put together by haber in the subjunctive tense and the past participle. Haya hablado, hayas hablado, haya hablado, hayamos hablado, hayáis hablado, hayan hablado. And then for er and ir, haya conjugation remains the same. The only thing that would change is the past participle. And for the regular past participles like beber or vivir, which end in er or ir, the ending would be ido. And then, of course, you might remember that there's a set of irregular past participles, and those are on page 493 in your book. Now let's go to the past perfect subjunctive, which is the one we just learned, pluscuamperfecto del subjuntivo. This one is put together by the past subjunctive of haber, that is hubiera, hubieras, hubiera, hubiéramos, hubierais, hubieran, and the past participle, hablado, bebido, vivido. So now let's talk about when do we use the subjunctive. You might recall that there are some conditions that require the use of the subjunctive, and I listed them for you here, the main ones. Will, influence, emotion, doubt or disbelief, and denial. And as you recall, the subjunctive is going to go into the subordinate clause. And then there's going to be a main clause of a sentence. For example, yo quiero que tú estudies. Yo quiero, that's the main clause. Que tú estudies, that is in the subjunctive, because I'm trying to influence you. And that brings me to the second point of when to use the subjunctive. If you have a sentence with two clauses and both of them have a different subject and they're trying to express one of these situations, will, influence, emotion, doubt, disbelief, or denial, then you do need the subjunctive. Okay, so you need those two conditions. Por ejemplo, los ciudadanos desean, that's will, que el candidato presidencial los escuche. The first clause, los ciudadanos desean. What's the subject? Los ciudadanos. The second clause, el candidato presidencial los escuche. What's the subject? El candidato presidencial. So we have two different subjects in those two clauses, and it's an expression of will. Therefore, I'm going to use the subjunctive. Similarly, on the second one, Alejandra se alegró mucho de que le dieran el trabajo. Alejandra se alegró, expression of emotion. Now comes the second clause, and that's where I'm going to need the subjunctive. De que le dieran el trabajo. That they gave her the job. They is the subject in that second clause. Lastly, dudo, yo dudo, que vaya a tener problemas para encontrar su maleta. That he or she may have issues finding his or her suitcase. So, two subjects, yo, he or she, and expression of doubt. And that's why I use the subjunctive there. Also, there are some conjunctions, and those are listed on the screen for you. A menos que, antes de que, con tal de que, en caso de que, para que, and sin que. Los ciudadanos desean, that's the first clause. El candidato presidencial los escuche, that's the subordinate clause. And they are linked by the word que. That is the conjunction. But it's not always going to be que. It could also be a menos que, antes de que, con tal de que, en caso de que, para que, sin que. It could also be cuando, después de que, en cuanto, hasta que, and tan pronto como. In the second set of conjunctions, you will use the subjunctive when they refer to future actions. Okay, this is important. So for these guys right here, cuando, después de que, en cuanto, hasta que, tan pronto como. If you have that conjunction linking the subordinate and the main clause, and they're referring to something that will happen in the future or the near future, then you use the subjunctive. Por ejemplo, let's look at this one, the second one first. Tan pronto como haga la tarea, as soon as she does the homework, or she does her homework. See, it's part of the second set. Podrá salir con sus amigos. She will be able to go out with her friends. That's a future action. Therefore, haga is in the subjunctive. Now, antes de que is part of this first group here. I know I need to use a subjunctive there. Cierra las ventanas antes de que empiece la tormenta. And then also, if we're referring to something indefinite or non-existent, then in that case, it's an expression of doubt in a way, because we don't know if something exists. Since we don't know that something exists, because it may or may not exist, then we're going to use the subjunctive. Also, what we just learned with the C clauses, if we're going to express something impossible, improbable, or contrary to fact, then we need the subjunctive. Ejemplo. Busco un empleado que haya estudiado computación. I'm looking for an employee that has studied IT. Or computers. Now, I don't know if such an employee exists. Therefore, I'm going to use the subjunctive tense here. Busco un empleado que haya estudiado computación. Another example would be, busco un restaurante que sirva comida coreana en San Antonio. Let's say that I don't know if such a place exists. Then I'm going to use que sirva. That's the subjunctive. And then let's go to the example of si hubieras. That's a si clause, and it is expressing something improbable or contrary to fact. In this case, it's contrary to fact. Si hubieras escuchado el noticiero, if you had listened to the news, you would have known about the earthquake. Okay, so that person didn't, so they didn't find out. So therefore, it's contrary to fact, and it's after a si clause. So in a nutshell, those are the instances where we will use the subjunctive tense. What about the indicative? Well, let's take a look at number 1 first. If we're certain, if we have an expression of belief and certainty, then we will use the indicative. So if you have words or phrases such as es cierto, then we know that that's going to be followed by a clause that is using the indicative. It is certain. Es cierto que Uruguay tiene unas playas espectaculares. Es verdad que la tierra es redonda. Also, let's jump to number 4 because that one is kind of related to number 1. If you have an expression with C, but you're expressing something possible, probable, or not contrary to fact, meaning it's real, then you're going to use the indicative and not the subjunctive. Pronto habrá más igualdad si luchamos contra la discriminación. So if we fight against discrimination, there will be more equality. Statement of fact. Okay, so number 1 and 4 are related in that way. There's certainty of belief in both of those. Let's take a look at number 3. If you're referring to something definite that you have mentioned in the main clause, you are going to use the indicative. For example, busco a la señora que me informó del crimen que ocurrió ayer. So this lady informed me of a crime that happened yesterday. So I know this person and this happened. That's for certain. Therefore, I'm going to use the indicative. Lastly, let's go to number 2. If you have these conjunctions, cuando, después de que, en cuanto, hasta que, tan pronto como, and they do not refer to future actions, then you're going to use the indicative. Hay más violencia cuando hay desigualdad social. There's more violence when there is social inequality. What about the infinitive? Well, you're going to use the infinitive if you are using an expression of will and influence, but there's no change of subject. For example, Martín desea ir a Montevideo este año. I'm not saying Martín desea que él vaya a Montevideo este año. I don't need to use the subjunctive in that example because he is the one who wishes and he is the one who wants to go to Montevideo. And number 2, you will use the infinitive after expressions of emotion when there is no change of subject. Me alegro de conocer a tu esposo. So I'm happy and I am the one that's meeting your husband. So therefore, me alegro de conocer versus me alegro, yo me alegro de que yo conozca. We don't need that. We don't need to use the subjunctive here. Same subject. Me alegro de conocer a tu esposo. And that wraps up the summary of the subjunctive. I will note a few activities that you guys should complete to get familiar with identifying what tense to use. In the next activity or the next class, we'll be talking about a composition, your last composition, and I will give you a reading. I'll give you also some questions to make sure that you understood the reading, and then I'll give you some questions to help you analyze the reading. And your homework will be to answer those questions in Flipgrid. The reason why I'm doing this is that if I analyze it for you, then you're going to be looking at my own perspective. However, if you answer those questions, if you think about the reading and analyze the reading based on the questions, then each of you may have different perspectives. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to answer those questions in Flipgrid on a video, and then I'm going to ask you to listen to what your classmates answered, because you might find that there may be other possibilities on how to analyze the reading. Okay. All right. That's it for this week. And yeah, we're on the home stretch. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Adios.